Welcome in, everybody, to our deep dive today. We're going to be talking about something that I think is super interesting and also kind of scary in a way.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to be unpacking this thesis that looks at the future of journalism,
Okay.
and specifically, how AI is going to change the way we consume and create news, and even how it's going to impact that whole concept of fair use,
Got it.
which gets really, really complicated. So let's just dive right in here.
Sounds good.
So picture this, right? It's 2030. You're sipping your morning coffee, catching up on the news, but the byline, it says generated by AI. Like, what's your gut reaction to that?
I mean, I think it's a really fascinating scenario and a little unnerving too, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Like, on the one hand, it's kind of cool to imagine AI being able to process information and create content that quickly.
Right.
But on the other hand, it does make you wonder what happens to the role of human journalists in that kind of future.
For sure, for sure. I think you hit the nail on the head there. It's definitely a double-edged sword, and that's exactly what this thesis we're going to be digging into today is all about. It's called The Impact of Generative AI on Copyright and Journalism.
Okay.
And it was written by Barak Kalmanovich, who has a really interesting perspective on this because he used to be the CEO of iNet,
Oh, wow.
which is a huge Israeli news site.
I see.
So he's been on the front lines of the digital media world for a long time.
Makes sense.
And one of the core questions he tackles in this thesis is this legal concept of fair use?
Mm-hmm.
This thing that's been around for centuries, even equipped to handle the way that AI consumes and regenerates content.
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It is. It is. And honestly, even for me, someone who, follows this stuff pretty closely, I've always found fair use to be kind of a gray area.
Yeah.
Like, I get that it lets you use copyrighted material without permission in certain situations, but where exactly do you draw the line?
Right.
It's tricky.
It really is. And I think in the U.S., the Copyright Act tries to lay out some guidelines. They have these 4 factors that courts consider when they're trying to decide if something is fair use.
Okay.
So those factors are the purpose of the use,
Mm-hmm.
the nature of the copyrighted work, the amount that's being used, and then the impact on the market for the original work.
Okay. That makes sense in theory, but then when you start talking about AI, I mean, it just gets so much more complicated.
Whoa, absolutely.
If an AI is trained on millions of news articles,
Right.
isn't that using like a massive amount?
Yeah.
And wouldn't AI-generated content directly compete with human journalists?
Mhm.
Like, wouldn't that impact the market?
You're hitting on 2 of the biggest challenges that AI poses to this whole idea of fair use.
Great.
Because think about it. A human journalist might quote a couple of paragraphs from a research paper to give some context.
Right.
But an AI can basically ingest and analyze millions of documents, right? Extracting patterns and insights.
It's like drinking from a fire hose versus taking a sip of water.
Exactly. And where is the line for how much is too much when you're talking about AI?
That's a great point. And then when it comes to the market impact, I mean, just imagine an AI that can churn out free articles that sound just like the ones you're paying for from the New York Times.
Right.
Would you keep subscribing?
It's a tough question, and that's actually the argument that the Times is making in their lawsuit against Microsoft and OpenAI.
Oh, wow. So this is actually happening. This isn't just some, theoretical
Yeah.
debate.
No, this is real, and it's playing out in the courts right now.
So what are they arguing specifically?
They're saying that OpenAI's models, the ones that power things like ChatGPT,
Yeah.
they were trained on huge amounts of copyrighted material.
Okay.
And now those models are generating content that's way too close to the Times' original reporting.
So they're basically saying that OpenAI is profiting off of their work.
That's essentially the gist of it, yeah.
Wow, and that raises a whole other ethical question too.
Absolutely.
Because if these AI companies are using all this copyrighted work without permission to create products that are then competing with the original creators,
Yeah.
doesn't that feel kind of wrong?
Yeah, it definitely raises those questions of unjust enrichment, right? Like if you're profiting from someone else's work without their consent or without compensating them,
Right.
it feels like something's off.
Especially if you're talking about journalism, which is already, kind of struggling to find its footing in this digital world.
And this is where things get even more complicated when you start looking at how different countries are approaching this whole issue of AI and copyright.
Okay, how so?
Well, the U.S. has always had this pretty flexible approach to fair use,
Okay.
but other regions are taking a much harder line.
Okay.
Like the EU, for instance, they're getting ready to roll out this new AI Act.
Mm-hmm.
And it basically says that you need explicit permission to use any copyrighted material for AI training.
So it's like opt-in instead of opt-out.
Exactly. And that's a huge difference from what we're seeing here in the US, where it's kind of like, wait and see how things play out.
So you've got these different legal systems. You've got this incredibly fast-moving technology, and then you've got the journalism industry, which is already in a state of flux.
It's a lot.
It feels like fair use.
Yeah.
You know, this thing that was meant to help balance copyright protection with the public's right to information.
Yeah.
It's being pushed to its breaking point.
It's definitely at a crossroads, and there are no easy answers.
I'm curious, though, you mentioned that journalists have historically relied on fair use quite a bit,
Mm-hmm.
especially for things like investigative journalism.
Oh, absolutely.
Think about like Watergate or the Pentagon Papers.
Right.
Those were huge stories that relied on copyrighted material.
Hmm.
Things like audio recordings and classified documents.
Yeah.
And those journalists were able to use that material under fair use to bring this incredibly important information to light.
And those cases really help shape our understanding of fair use as a tool for holding power accountable.
For sure. And what about news aggregators like Google News or
Mm.
Apple News?
Mm.
I mean, they're constantly summarizing articles from different sources,
Right.
and they're arguably relying on fair use to do that.
Yeah.
But then I remember that case, Associated Press versus Meltwater,
Ah, yeah.
where the court actually said that Meltwater, this news aggregation service, they weren't using content fairly.
Right. And that case was really interesting because it showed how even before AI came along, there were these gray areas and debates about how fair use applied in the digital world.
So it seems like these questions about how to draw the line with fair use, they've been brewing for a while.
Oh, definitely. And AI is just adding a whole new layer of complexity to the mix.
It's like taking something that was already complicated and then turning the dial up to 11.
Exactly. And as AI continues to evolve at this crazy pace, those lines are only going to get blurrier.
That's a little scary, honestly, but also kind of exciting.
I think that's the perfect way to put it.
This is a brave new world we're entering, and we better be prepared for the challenges ahead.
I couldn't agree more.
We've been talking a lot about how AI is basically turning this whole fair use thing on its head, especially for journalism.
Yeah.
But part of me is also kind of curious, like, could AI actually be helpful to journalists?
That's a question that a lot of folks in the industry are wrestling with. And I
Yeah.
think the answer is, well, it's complicated.
Okay, I like complicated.
AI could be a powerful tool for journalists, but it could also be a really disruptive force.
So let's start with the tool part. How could AI actually make a journalist's life easier?
Okay, well, imagine all those tasks that journalists have to do that take up a ton of time but aren't necessarily the most creative parts of the job.
Okay, yeah, like what?
Things like transcribing interviews,
Oh, yeah.
sifting through mountains of data to find that one nugget of information,
All right.
fact-checking, making sure all the details are right,
Right.
translating articles for a global audience.
Yeah, and that stuff can be super tedious.
Exactly. And AI could potentially handle a lot of that heavy lifting.
So it's like having a super efficient research assistant
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
working 24/7.
Right. And that would free up journalists to focus on the things that humans are still really good at. The in-depth reporting, the analysis, building relationships with sources, crafting those really compelling narratives.
The storytelling part.
Exactly. And this isn't just some futuristic fantasy.
Oh, yeah.
Some news organizations are already using AI for these types of tasks.
Really? Like who?
Bloomberg, for example, they've been using AI for financial reporting for years.
Huh. Interesting.
They have these algorithms that can analyze earnings reports and market data and generate news stories in a flash.
I mean, I guess that makes sense. I can't even imagine trying to keep up with the financial markets as a human.
Right. It's just too much data too fast.
Yeah.
And then the BBC, they've been experimenting with AI for translation.
Oh, wow.
Which is really cool because it means they can make their content accessible to a much wider audience.
So it's about breaking down language barriers.
Exactly, and ensuring that information can reach as many people as possible.
That's awesome. So it's not all doom and gloom.
No, not at all. There are definitely ways that AI can be used to augment and even enhance the work of human journalists.
I like that word augment.
Yeah, it's about adding to what humans can do, not replacing them.
Right. But I do feel like there's a big caveat here.
Oh, absolutely.
It's got to be about humans using AI to make their reporting better and more impactful, not the other way around.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Right.
We don't want to end up in a world where algorithms are deciding what news we see and how it's framed.
Right. Like who's controlling the narrative?
Exactly. It's got to be about finding that balance, that sweet spot where AI can enhance human capabilities without compromising the integrity and ethics of journalism.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it, that sweet spot. So how do we actually get there? How do we find that balance?
Well, Komanovich's thesis offers some really interesting ideas.
Okay, I'm all ears.
He argues that we need to rethink how copyright law applies to AI.
Okay.
And he suggests some specific measures for journalism because of the vital role it plays in a democratic society.
Earlier we talked about those broader recommendations like updating copyright laws to account for AI, maybe having some kind of collective licensing system where AI companies pay for the right to use copyrighted material
Right.
and giving creators more control over how their work is used.
Exactly. So those are kind of like the big picture ideas.
Right. What about the ideas specific to journalism?
Okay, well, one interesting proposal is to create a special category of protection for news content.
So recognizing that news isn't just any other type of content.
Right. It plays a really unique and essential role in informing the public and holding powerful people and institutions accountable.
It's the lifeblood of a functioning society.
Exactly. And he goes even further. He
Ah,
proposes something called digital quotation rights.
okay, now you're talking my language. What's that?
So imagine this. Every time an AI model pulls information from a news article to generate its own content,
Mm-hmm.
the publisher of that original article gets a small payment.
Okay, so it's kind of like how musicians get royalties when their songs are played on the radio.
Exactly. It's about creating a system where both sides benefit.
Okay, I like where this is going. AI developers get access to the information they need to train their models, and news organizations get a cut of the revenue generated by those models.
That seems fair. I mean, it would incentivize AI companies to be more mindful about how they're using news content.
Right.
And it would ensure that the journalists who created that content are at least getting some compensation.
Exactly, because right now it's kind of a one-way street.
Totally. I can't tell you how many times I've seen an AI summarize a news article and thought, well, someone actually wrote that original article.
Right, someone did the reporting, the writing, the editing.
And they deserve to be recognized for that work.
Absolutely. And another key recommendation is transparency.
Okay.
Kalmanovich argues that news outlets should be upfront about when they're using AI in their work.
So it's about giving readers the information they need to make informed decisions about what they're reading.
Exactly. Transparency builds trust, and trust is crucial in journalism. I could see that working maybe like a little note at the bottom of an article saying, this article was written by a human journalist, but an AI assistant helped with fact-checking and research.
Exactly, something like that. So readers know what's going on behind the scenes.
Okay, all this starting to sound pretty promising, but I got to play devil's advocate here for a second.
Sure.
Are there any downsides to these solutions? Like, could they backfire in some way?
That's a great question. And it's always important to think about the potential unintended consequences.
Right.
One concern is that if we make it too difficult or expensive for AI companies to access information, we might stifle innovation.
That makes sense. We don't want to create a system that benefits huge media companies
Yeah.
at the expense of smaller AI startups or independent developers.
Exactly. It's got to be a level playing field.
So it's all about finding that balance again.
It always comes back to balance, doesn't it?
It seems like that's the theme of our conversation today.
Finding that sweet spot where we can encourage the development of AI tools that are beneficial, while also protecting the rights of creators and ensuring the integrity of journalism.
And speaking of balance, you know, one thing that's been on my mind throughout this whole discussion is the human element.
Yeah.
Like, we've been talking a lot about the legal and technical aspects of AI and copyright, but what about the emotional impact?
That's such an important point, and one that I think often gets overlooked in these conversations.
Technology is important, but ultimately it's about people.
Absolutely.
Journalism, at its heart, is about human connection. It's about telling stories that resonate with people, informing them, empowering them, making them think, maybe even making them feel something.
Yeah.
Can AI ever truly replicate that human touch?
That's a question that philosophers and scientists are grappling with right now.
Yeah.
Can AI ever truly understand human emotions?
Right.
The nuances of language, the subtle ways that we connect with each other through stories.
It's a question that goes way beyond copyright law.
It really does.
It gets into the very nature of consciousness and creativity.
Yeah. And as AI continues to evolve at this breakneck pace, those questions are only going to become more and more pressing.
Wow, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive into generative AI and journalism, huh?
Yeah, for sure. From the ins and outs of fair use to, the potential for AI to be both a tool and a disruptor in the newsroom.
But I got to say, one thing that keeps coming back to me is this whole question of authorship.
Yeah, that's a big one when AI is generating content that's basically indistinguishable from something a human wrote. How do we even define who the author is?
Right. It's like that thought experiment we were talking about earlier.
Mhm.
If I tell an AI to write a poem in the style of Maya Angelou, who owns the copyright?
Yeah, is it you, the AI, Maya Angelou's estate? I mean, it's a question that's still very much up in the air, legally speaking.
It's mind-boggling, and it goes beyond just like the legal ownership. It raises these really fundamental questions about what creativity and originality even mean in the age of AI.
Yeah, and how do we ensure that the original creators are treated fairly? The human artists, writers, and journalists whose work is being used to train these AI models.
Right. It's not just about giving credit where credit is due. It's about recognizing the value of human ingenuity, that spark of inspiration that AI, at least for now, can't replicate.
I think that's a really important point.
And, we've been talking about those lawsuits between the New York Times and OpenAI,
Mm-hmm.
where they're arguing that AI is infringing on copyright by using their articles to create new content.
Right.
But what about the readers? Do they even care if an article is written by a human or an AI?
That is such a fascinating question, and I think it gets to the heart of what journalism is all about. And
Yeah.
actually, some studies are starting to show that readers do place a higher value on human-written content.
Especially when it comes to news.
Exactly. There's something about knowing that a real person with their own lived experiences and perspectives has put that story together.
I think it brings a level of empathy and understanding that's hard to replicate with an algorithm.
Right. And there's a certain trust that comes with knowing there's a human journalist behind the words.
Someone who's done the research,
Hmm.
fact-checked the information, and made those editorial decisions.
It makes me think of that old saying, people don't want to be informed, they want to feel informed.
I love that, and I think that feeling comes from that human connection.
But here's something to think about. What if AI becomes so advanced that it can actually understand and mimic human emotions?
Oh, whoa.
What if it can write stories that are not only factually accurate, but also emotionally resonant? Like, really tap into those deeper levels of the human experience.
Okay, now we're getting into science fiction territory.
Maybe, but it's not as far-fetched as it might seem. I mean, AI is evolving at such an incredible pace.
That's true.
And if we reach a point where AI can genuinely capture the human experience, what will that mean for the role of journalists, for the future of storytelling?
Those are some big questions.
You really are.
And it just highlights why it's so important to be having these conversations now.
Right now.
Before AI reshapes the media landscape
Mm.
in ways we might not even be able to imagine yet.
It's about being proactive, not reactive, thinking critically about the potential benefits and risks of AI, and making sure that we're steering its development in a direction that aligns with our values.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are some key takeaways for our listeners?
I think the most important takeaway is that AI is a powerful tool. And like any tool, it can be used for good or for bad.
It's a double-edged sword,
It really is. And it's up to us to make sure that it's used ethically and responsibly.
especially when it comes to journalism.
Yeah, it's about finding that balance between embracing the potential of AI.
While also preserving those core values of truth, accuracy, and accountability.
Exactly. AI can be a huge asset in the newsroom.
Yeah.
It can help journalists work more efficiently, reach more people, and even uncover stories that might have otherwise gone unnoticed.
Right. But we have to remember that AI should complement human journalists, not replace them.
It's about empowering journalists, not automating them out of existence.
And ultimately, it's about making sure that journalism continues to play that vital role that's always played in a democratic society.
Holding power to account, informing the public, and fostering a healthy and engaged citizenry.
We've only just scratched the surface of this topic, but hopefully this deep dive has given everyone some food for thought.
Yeah, maybe even spark some new questions.
This has been an amazing conversation. Thank you so much for being such a thoughtful guide.
It's been my pleasure.
It's clear that the future of journalism, and I think the future of creativity itself, is being written as we speak.
And we all have a role to play in shaping that future.
So keep asking those tough questions, stay informed, and engage in these conversations because the story of AI and humanity, it's only just beginning.